All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Beachside chat. Hello, Christy and UCLA School of Nursing. I figured we'd get started once we have at least 50, which we do. So that is a great turnout so far. And for anyone who has not joined us for a Beachside chat in the past, welcome to this format. I'm Alison Hamilton, your host, and I lead the UCLA Rapid, Rigorous, Relevant Implementation Science Hub, which is part of a group of hubs, all focused on supporting projects oriented toward ending the HIV epidemic. Yay, that. So this is an informal time for us. We all love talking with one another, and we also love hearing your thoughts and ideas. We're trying something new today just for fun, to get together and talk about some of our papers that we keep going back to for one reason or another. And I will just say that we all independently chose our papers. We didn't, I don't think, influence each other too much. We just picked papers that we had in mind, and interestingly and happily, they coalesce really nicely with one another. So we're excited to share our thoughts with you and hear your questions and comments throughout our time together. I'm just going to bring up a couple of slides really quickly, and then we'll come back out of the slide mode. And I did want to note that unfortunately, we will not be able to have Erin Finley with us today. She is in the middle of an ice storm and has no power or Wi-Fi. So we wish her the best, and we'll miss her. And we'll carry on. And we weren't sure we were going to have Matt, so we're very excited that Matt was able to join. So once again, just in case you're wondering what meeting you signed on to, this is the Implementation Science Beachside Chat, hosted by our hub at UCLA. And we're going to be talking today with our wonderful and illustrious consultants. So those are these folks here. And we've done introductions at many prior events. So if you don't know who these folks are, you will get to know them through their presentations of their papers. And my guess is you pretty much do already know who they are. But if not, we can certainly do more intros. The papers that we're going to be talking about are listed here. We can certainly send these to everyone. They're also in Twitter, and I believe Elena also sent them to all of our registrants. So thank you, Elena, for that. And I just want to mention, in case we don't want to come back to slides later, we will send out an evaluation later. We have a growing YouTube playlist with a lot of methods workshops and beachside chats. So please feel free to check out that playlist and let us know if you have any questions. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing slides and we'll come back together. So our purpose, as I mentioned before, just for anyone who may have joined after I mentioned it, was really just to come together and have an informal chat about papers that have intrigued us, motivated us, challenged us, papers that we go back to as we're teaching, mentoring, training, thinking, writing grants, writing papers. Of course, we don't have much time to do this, so we each just picked one or two. And we're not trying to draw a whole lot of threads between them, although there are certainly a lot of threads to draw. So Elena kindly put the citations in the chat as well, and she'll put anything else that you need there too. Please feel free to put your own comments and questions in the chat. And we're going to get started with Dr. Curran. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
So how's this going to work? So there's 3 basic questions that you wanted us to cover on our paper.
Mm-hmm. Why this paper? What are your kind of key points or takeaways from it, and how has it informed your own implementation, research, and thinking and doing?
Okay, great. So I selected a recent paper from our colleagues and friends, the lead author, Renat Betis, promises and pitfalls in our field. And it was kind of a cool exercise that a large group of well-funded, productive researchers did, where they were kind of trying to contemplate, okay, our field is an adolescent, we're kind of a teenager, an early 20s field, and where might be some of the pitfalls or the threats to our discipline. And it wasn't just about sort of, hey, here's some things that might be a problem, but they also offered some potential solutions, and some ways that, we could think and act to try to make sure, or to do all that we can, that these potential pitfalls might not actually happen. I actually think some of them are happening now. And so I found it useful, especially to see some of these things, which I think it's not a potential pitfall. I think we're sort of in a sort of a danger zone. So I thought it was a good time for us to have a paper like this to reflect. I thought this group of authors were very well qualified to comment on this. I love that they offered these solutions. And I also thought that it offered something for everybody in the field. Folks who are relatively new, folks who are mid-career, folks who are senior, folks who are sort of implementers and learning about the field. We had this paper as the topic of a journal club in the spring. And we often do alternating sessions in our journal club where we choose like a brand new paper that someone thinks is cool that we should focus on, and then we also have like read classic papers too. So this was a recent kind of new paper, and it was fun to see a whole bunch of different people read it and take from it what they did. So I am a more senior researcher in the field, and I also have a job where I get paid to build capacity. So in some key points that I want to draw, I'm going to focus, really from those two points of view, one more about the science and one more about capacity building, if that's okay. How am I doing so far? Okay. So it talked about 6 potential pitfalls. I'm going to talk about 2 of them, more or less. So I am concerned about our field creating its own evidence to practice gap. I am concerned about us making a bunch of stuff that nobody uses, because maybe the process that we used was such that the stuff is not super accessible, or might not be super able to be applied across a lot of different places. So I was really moved by the information that they had in the, well, how can we do better about this? Or how can we maybe make this not happen as much or at all? And I really was moved by their conversation about pragmatism and, really trying to, integrate, and highly partner with end users and implementers, and trying to make sure that what we are building isn't something that's so big and esoteric and possibly too theory driven that it might not actually work or work well across a whole bunch of places in either things, intervention types, or contexts. And I really like this notion that they floated of, maybe some of us, in the field could be focusing some of our work on like some common sets of strategies, which could be applicable, generalizable across things, interventions, practices, and possibly contexts. So I love that idea. I think some of that is happening now in the field, but maybe not with a whole lot of direction. Like there seems to be a pretty nice package emerging around prescribing behaviors that, seem like a nice set to build from or adapt. So I was really moved by that, and I'll talk about how that impacts my own work in a second. The other one was, I mean, I really found this article helpful, as somebody whose job it is to build capacity. And so it was nice for them to lay out some of these groups of people, basic science folks, who might not necessarily do this kind of thing, but they do need to know about it and have that be sort of in their mind, perhaps, that about as they build stuff, right? And then they talked about other kinds of researchers who might use implementation science in their toolkits, services researchers, clinical trialists, other folks that might not, necessarily devote their whole career to it, but they probably should be using this in their toolkit and be thinking more about it. And then, people who want to do this and are doing this, for a living, like many of us here on the panel. And then they didn't explicitly mention a fourth group in this part, but I think but they did in other parts, which is this sort of people who want to use implementation science, implementers, those folks who are in a system. And, these are people that we should be partnering with a whole lot to try to help us deal with the other issue, which is developing pragmatic approaches and strategies. So how is it affecting my work? Well, right now, the focus on trying not to create our evidence gap, it's helping me to focus now on my work in the pharmacy context, in the community pharmacy context, and with pharmacists and with pharmacy interventions, and trying to really line up partners. And we created a rural pharmacy network to try to have infrastructure and build partners to help us build and test stuff that might actually be applicable and work soon in these contexts, because it really seems like this kind of work is critical to solve problems that we hear about from these partners, build strategies that they think might actually work and could actually be useful. So I was trying to do this anyway, but having this paper helped me to bring clarity to that thought and some direction. And then the last point, this paper has helped me in my planning work for capacity building. In our CTSA application, which we have to turn in May, I'm kind of using some of this work to highlight some of the training that we are that we will newly develop for the basic science folks on our campus, for the trialists, for some of the folks who likely need to work with us more, but they might not necessarily do it for a living, and also for the junior people in our field that we're trying to help do this work and get funded, but also and especially trying to take a health systems learning approach with practitioners and QI folks in our hospital setting, and trying to do more of the translating from our science to practice and making this actionable, which they do a good job with in the VA and some other places, but here locally we really haven't. So trying to kind of be inspired by that and move this forward. And this paper kind of helped me to justify and line up some of my thoughts, which might not have been as clear until I read this. And so it's been very helpful. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Geoff. Much food for thought, and a couple comments from Matt and Anna. Anything that anyone wants to pick up on before we talk about the next paper via Russ? Matt, are you having a thought?
I just agree. It's yeah, I've often thought about the irony of recreating the evidence practice gap when that was the initial genesis of our whole field. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
And I think one of the themes for me that's coming up across these papers and these discussions is replicability. And we are going to have a workshop on that with Matt this
Say,
month. So stay tuned for more on replication and implementation science. That's one of our, I think, connecting threads across these is a push toward more replication.
I couldn't agree more with that point, both Geoff and that you're making, Allison. I'm really pumped to hear Matt's talk about that. I just about picked his paper on that for the one I was going to talk about today, but I think that's so critical. And I also love other people have looked at Elvin Ging's work on that and what he calls transportability, which is related, but, somewhat different than the way I think, at least I usually think about generalization or replicability. Getting back to Geoff's paper, I also loved this. To me, one of the things that really, frankly, gave me a little bit of deja vu and resonated to was the point that they made about in attempting to justify that we are a science, to particularly basic science, and I'm an NIH guy. So, and again, when I was there, I think in the field, I'm also older than I think anybody on the call, but when we first started coming out, there was a lot of impression that these are just a bunch of squishy, soft do-gooders, but this isn't science. And I think in trying to address that, they hear that we may have created, or at least as Geoff said, I don't think we're in a horrible place, but I think we are at, quote, risk of doing some of these things, that we made our science so inaccessible and so ivory tower and so complex that it's just not accessible or maybe replicable or that sort of thing. So I really found that kind of provocative, and to think about how we now can be more rapid, which itself is getting a lot more attention and a moderate amount of pushback, I think, from, if you will, the traditional trialist or people there. So I think that notion, and as Geoff said, how we can really become and contribute to a learning health system is, one of the fun challenges and opportunities ahead of us.
Absolutely. You're getting some agreement from our audience too. Well, I think we could probably talk about any one of these papers for the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially this one, because it was so broad.
There's
anyway,
so much. And I think about all of the ones that we have on the list, and they all merit a lot of discussion, but maybe we can plant some seeds in our minds and others. And Russ, hear about paper that you chose about context, another one of our big themes, I think, with these papers. Do you want to share some thoughts about your paper?
Sure, I'd love to, and I'll try to be uncharacteristically brief here. If I can. You could keep me on point, Allison, if I meander. Well, I chose this paper for maybe 4 different reasons. Only one of them has to do with really the characteristics that Allison mentioned there. Primarily, I chose it just because I wanted to read it, and I saw it, and it's been on my list. I haven't had a chance to read it. But in addition to that, I chose it for a variety of reasons. One of them was that this is by an international group that, quite honestly, I don't know that well. I think in our back and forth, Geoff says that he does know them, but a group at Basel, Switzerland, some other places. But I think it's always healthy for us to kind of look outside our own little, so we don't get so insular or whatever. Anna does incredible global work, but at least for many of us, I think we get kind of thinking about US centric here too much. That was one reason. Second one is I just thought they really used some innovative approaches. And if any of you have a chance to look at it, They have, love the acronym, what they call the banana approach to looking at the characteristics of research in this review that they did. And somebody may need to help me in chat, but I believe I know that's started for Basel. I think maybe it's the Basel approach for context analysis. I just love that and some of the innovative approaches here. Thirdly, I was really intrigued with, and what struck me is that I think they had some of the best visual displays that I've seen, where you can just grasp characteristics and some really cool color-coded figures there that I don't know. I think that's something I struggle with, is how can you succinctly and maybe particularly visually, communicate something to an audience. So I love that. And then the content reason I chose it is because it's about context, as it saw there. And I think it was helpful for me to kind of reflect on methods that have been used. And again, even I think the subtitle of their paper is an evidence gap. So what did I take away from it? Well, again, the first one was this banana approach or way of thinking that I did find useful. They have 6 kind of characteristics involved in doing this, that they evaluated the studies that they identified here. Against, I won't go into all of those, but I think an important one I'll come back to was engagement of what they called implementation agents. And that involves getting all the relevant perspectives that were there. And then another one was using the information, your understanding of context, to impact not only initial planning and implementation strategies, that I think a lot of us do, but also to think about outcomes and the impact. And I think I see that far less often. Let's see. I think one of the most provocative and disappointing things in there, often we find when we do a literature review, that they did a pretty systematic review of all the things, the literature on implementation interventions between 2015 and 2020 of this, and they found that only 22% of those actually reported anything on context, and I found that pretty sobering. Of those, the studies that did report on that they did a further deeper dive, is they key areas that weren't, in terms of an evidence gap, done as much as others, were this notion of engaging all the implementation partners. Again, many of the studies did kind of one group or whatever, but not the others, including kind of the end recipients there. Second, I thought this notion about context generally not being used to think about later stages of our programs or our project, particularly thinking about sustainment issues there. So just quickly then, this last point Alison asked us to reflect on impact on our own work. It's honestly too early to tell, since I am still reflecting on this now. But I think one thing that struck me there that I'd like to think about, how can we pragmatically do this, was greater use of observation methods. In looking at it, there was a moderate amount of qualitative, a moderate amount of quantitative work done. I think we can still be more innovative, as exemplified by Alison and Erin and a few others there. There's work to be done there, but I also think this notion of observation of different type is just really done too infrequently. Second, it's caused me to reflect on the systems issues involved in this complex chain and dynamic chain of events we have, that, from not only context that this focus on, but then how does that relate to the intervention we're studying, to the implementation strategies that we're starting with and adapting, and then to the outcomes there. But I think this notion of outcomes is something I'm reflecting on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Russ. Yeah, there was really a lot to process in this review, and I think that point about observation and just I thought they did a really good job of breaking down, what all the different methodological approaches were, and there's just so much, there's so much room for growth and room to challenge ourselves in these areas. It ties really well to some of the points that were made in the paper that I'm going to talk about too. So I might circle back to a couple of those points when it's my turn. And hi, David. Yes, I think Elena can probably put links in. I know she's put titles. We can try to get those links in too and add them to the slides. So any comments for Russ's paper before we move on to Matt's? I think we'll be able to circle back to several of these topics. So maybe we can go to Matt's and then see where we land after that. We have some theory stuff coming up in the next three of us.
This is like, yeah, it's a whirlwind, but so cool. So I guess when I first heard about this, I was thinking more of some of the the classics. So I know folks chose papers that were a little bit more current, which is great. So this one is from Per Nelson, Making Sense of Implementation Theories, back in 2015 in Implementation Science. And I think the reason I kind of chose this, and also the answering the third question and for my work, are sort of the same thing. So I even though I've been around a little bit, trying to hold in your head the difference between models and theories and frameworks is not easy. And so I just so appreciated Per Nelson's way to kind of classify all these different things and just put them in a way that was, I think, pretty easy to understand. The basic idea, and there's just this one figure in there, like if you don't even want to read any of the words, that one figure I think is pretty good. There's these three main buckets, right? So these, I'll call them things for now, not the Geoff Curran things, but a different kind of thing. So you have, you want to describe and or guide the process of translating research into practice. That's one bucket. Understanding and explaining what influences implementation outcomes. That's the second bucket. And then evaluating implementation. That understanding and or explaining actually then subdivides into three sub buckets. So determinant frameworks, CFR is sort of one of the best examples. Basically, a whole list of barriers and facilitators that influence implementation. Classic theories like diffusion of innovation theory, and then implementation theories, which are sort of specially created from scratch within the implementation ecosphere. And so I think, that map is like you are here. I mean, it's really helpful to kind of know where you are amongst all these frameworks and theories. And so I think it's just a really well put together paper. Some key sort of observations. I think that one of the things, so this is 2015, and it's really helpful to know sort of where we've been and where we are now. In this paper, not a single mention of equity anywhere. And so, that was 8 years ago now. And now, I think the idea that disparities are sort of a special case of implementation failure is, I think, well established, and that, implementation science has a very big role to play in addressing the lack of equity, I think is very firmly established. And I think that's we've made a lot more to do, but at least there is a good recognition, and that wasn't true, back in 2015. And another thing that Per calls for is, that we do need more empirical evidence, and that it's great that we come up with these models and these frameworks, but we shouldn't really just stop there. And, though, it might seem elegant and a good description, that we should go further and actually try to develop an evidence base, that proves or that substantiates these theories, so that we do in fact trust that, A to B to C is actually true in the real world, not just in a few people's heads. So I think we have a lot more work to do there. And I think in terms of informing my work, I think I kind of use all 5 of these things. So process models, describing and process of translating research into practice. So getting to outcomes, this sort of a capacity building model, it is a 10-step process. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this. It's sort of bullseye process model when and then we've used determinant frameworks like CFR to try to see how getting to outcomes is helping or not helping, or where and what influences what levers we were pulling on or not pulling on to actually get the outcomes that we were getting. And then of course using evaluation frameworks like RE-AIM it's really been helpful, especially in some of the VA work where we were looking at peer specialists and their people with mental illnesses helping other people with mental illnesses to kind of track their spread and their reach. So RE-AIM played a really important role in that. So I think I'll stop there. So trying to be briefer.
No, that's great. And I this is such a classic, along with Rachel Tabak's work and some of those other sort of foundational, how do we make sense of theories, models, frameworks. And there's also a paper by Laura Damschroeder about making sense out of chaos, really thinking like, what are we doing with theory and implementation? I think it ties really well, Matt, to the paper that I selected. And some of the points are similar across the 2 papers. So I'm actually and it ties really well to the theory paper that you're gonna discuss too, Anna, in terms of, where are we with theory and implementation science. So I'm just gonna jump into mine, hoping that might give us a little chance for discussion after we've pulled some of these points together. So I chose Kislov's paper about harnessing the power of theorizing and implementation research, a paper I've read many times from 2019. And of course, a lot has happened even since this paper came out in terms of theorizing, more attention to equity, as you mentioned, Matt. And this, there's so much that I come back to in this paper often as mainly as a challenge to myself and to the work that I'm trying to do, and that I don't always do as much as I want to do. But let me just preface by saying that the paper, it's an editorial, and they argue that we need in the field to move from theory as sort of this monolithic accepted or received wisdom to theorizing. So, really thinking about this as a process, and that we need to move toward theory building and theoretically informative implementation research. These are all terms that they use in this editorial. So, there is this danger, and we've heard about some of these dangers in the field. There is this danger that we just sort of accept a given theory and say, okay, I need to use this theory as it is, non-problematized, sort of critically evaluated, because it's a good theory, or it's a theory that everyone else is using, or it's a theory that has constructs that I really like, or that makes sense for my question. But we haven't, according to this paper, and I tend to agree, we haven't necessarily broken up theories as much as we could. Some, there are some that have been certainly evolved and really interrogated, but we could do more, they argue, from this sort of mid-range theory perspective, and do more work related to sort of dynamic processes, relationships. At the time, they mentioned paying attention to issues like gender, power, equality, and this is definitely going to come up in that paper that you're going to talk with us about too, Anna. And so being an anthropologist, these are things that I think about a lot. And I remembered when Matt and I and our colleagues were doing our set of studies in specialty mental health, 2 decades ago now. And we met with Dwayne Simpson, who was the developer of the program change model, which we used at the time and was very strong in constructs related to organizational readiness in particular. And I remember him saying, don't just take my theory as it is, like, see, beat it up, see what you can do with it. Maybe it's not right. Maybe some parts of it are not right. Let's try to, push where we can go with this theoretically. And I never felt like I did enough with that. And so I come back to papers like this. And I'm like, oh, right. That's what I want to be doing more of is building theory, thinking about, how do the findings that we generate from our implementation studies help to transform and evolve and advance theory in ways that can help the field. And there's sort of that tension between, the need for theory and why we need theory, which I think is something that we all often are helping and mentoring people with is, well, yeah, I know I have to have a theory, but I don't really know why I have to have a theory. And Per Nilsson's paper is a great paper to go to answer that question. But it's not only becoming familiar with the role that theory plays, but really having it kind of feature more centrally in how we do the work that we do. So they make the point, for example, that we need to avoid shopping lists of themes. And some of the things that they talk about remind me of qualitative analysis. So in our approach to analysis, we try to emphasize coding rather than the code, a process of coding, a process of analyzing, rather than kind of plunking codes down within a sort of non-critical way. And they also make a really strong point about tying to grand theories, meta theories. They're called different things in different fields. There's another great diagram. I think we're all drawn to great diagrams in our papers, in our selected papers. There's a great diagram in this paper that shows the interrelationships between our sort of micro level theories that are maybe specific to a given intervention or implementation effort, and then those mid-range theories and the connection to grand theories. And one that they list is ethnography, which is of course central to anthropology. So that really brought me back to your point, Russ, about the value and importance of observation and just, I think, expanding our methodological toolkit in the field and the role that expansion could play in theorizing and in advancing this idea of theory building and of doing, theoretically informed work. So I take it personally because, this is stuff I'm supposed to know how to do and I really like to do. I think the challenge for me is finding the time and the bandwidth to do that type of thinking, which I'm guessing everyone struggles with. And so just carving out that space for thinking theoretically, critiquing, really looking at the data we have and seeing where that drives us in terms of how do we conceptualize our outcomes, as you mentioned, Russ? Are we really threading that theory or the theories, models, frameworks that we've selected through all of our work, onto outcomes, onto replication, sustainability? We tend to be more sort of heavily weighed toward the front end. Okay, I've got to use this theory to set up my data collection, et cetera, but we don't, really carry it through. So I think the critiques are well taken and in this paper, and there are some really interesting recommendations they make in terms of defining interventions functionally. So it's not just what is the intervention, but what is it doing? And we've seen a lot of growth in that forms and functions side of things in the field, thinking about context as a process rather than as a place or a space, which ties really nicely back to the paper that you discussed, Russ, and doing more with exploring experiences and relationships. And that's where, qualitative methods can play a big role, observation can play a big role, and other methods that we perhaps really haven't brought into the field as much as we could, and other meta theories such as phenomenology that we could consider potential role for in our work. So these are the types of things that make me excited to think and to figure out, how am I going to do this in my work, and how can I kind of live up to, or attempt to live up to, the calls that they make in this paper and the other ones we're discussing, to find that role for theorizing, but at the same time not making the work inaccessible. So I have that sort of tension, that pragmatic tension of, I really care about theory, but I also don't want this to be the navel gazing, as they talk about in the paper. So those are a few thoughts about that paper. I highly recommend it. Every time I read it, something else comes to mind. And I think we all feel the same about the papers that we've talked about so far. So I'm guessing that connects, Anna, to some of the things that you're observing in your papers that you selected without us. It's like, are you sure you want to pick a paper by two of us in the group?
Of course, yes. So many things, and I drink coffee, so buckle up.
Watch out.
So a couple of things. One is, I do want to highlight Russ and I put the same link for the website on theories, models, and frameworks. There's a lot of work happening behind the scenes. So that website is sharing, the classic theories, models from Rachel Tabak. We've added more, and now there's a lot of work bringing equity in that space. So as Russ mentioned, there is an under special topics tab. Meredith Forth has been doing beautiful work in identifying constructs on equity. And then Callie Bailey Wash is doing a systematic review, which on equity frameworks to add to that. So there's a lot of work happening in that theorizing space and trying to bring equity. Matt, I knew, but I hadn't put it explicit about Per Nielsen's paper and the length and how we are in the field, which it was really cool, your comment. Okay, so that was one comment. The second comment was, this was hard because I would choose any paper written by any one of the panelists, right? And so it was one of those, like, do I talk with Alison about her paper and Russ about his paper, or do I talk to you about why you should read their work? It's very confusing. So I chose two because I break the laws all the time. And if you haven't read them, let me walk you through why I think you should read them. We've been talking about context, and we've been talking about theories, and we've been talking about the pitfalls in our fields, right? And Alison and Erin tell us why you should do qualitative work in our work, right? So why you should go deep and examine the why and the how, whatever it is that you're doing works or does not work. And it is one of the best introduction papers that I've read about the field, because it's dense as it can be and it's easy to read, which is something in itself, right? So they walk us through all the classic themes and terms and qualitative methods. They tell us through examples about why you should do qualitative work, what kind of qualitative works are out there, and they give you examples. So it's the paper where you learn about things, and then you have a whole set of citations where you can go and dig deeper in their rapid qualitative methods, observational methods, what kind of books you should read. It's a paper that I send to every single consultant that I have and partner that I have that want to do qualitative work. It's like, first read this and then come back and then we can talk about it. So, and anything that any one of the panelists write, you should read anyways. Now, let me tell you why I chose a second one. At the end of Alison's and Erin's paper, they talk about theory. And they say that there is something called deductive analysis, where you use the theory to inform your work and your methods and your analysis and your coding. And then they have the sentence saying, but hold your horses because that might not fit. And you end the paper saying, okay, but what does that mean? I don't know what that means, right? And it means exactly what we're saying, that the theories, methods, and frameworks may not fit necessarily your data. And we have examples of that in the field. Okay, after you read this paper, and we've convinced you about the importance of qualitative work in the field of implementation science, you should get a cup of chamomile tea, sit down in a comfortable chair, and read the second paper. This paper, I read it, and every single time that I go back, it blows my mind and it messes me up. So I come to this paper as an adaptation scientist and as a health equity scientist, okay? And I will tell you why later, as someone who just published a review in dissemination frameworks and got lost in that space as bananas. So qualitative work is important, right? It's important because it tells us the things that we're saying in terms of the context. What is the context? What happened? Why are we failing? Why are we doing the pitfalls? And what is working, and how can we replicate then whatever it is working in different settings? And then Claire Snod says, hold on, we have frameworks and theories, but pay attention where they were born, who developed them, and how we're using them. And the consequences of that when we think about power, privilege, and equity. That's why you have a sip of your quality of your chamomile tea. You're like, oh, Lord. The summary, I will say, of this paper, from my perspective, is that we are in a danger in the field of implementation science of being colonizers. That's it. Now let me walk you through it. Now that I got you uncomfortable, because you should read the paper. Let me walk you through it. They talk about 3 different things. One, they talk about what it means to have an evidence-based intervention. Even a definition of implementation science field is implement an evidence-based intervention in usual care setting. And there's a dot there, right? It stops in there. That's your NIH definition. That's your Brian Midman definition that we all cite. That's the definition that we all write in our papers. I've written in my papers. And then they ask us to really think about what evidence-based means. Who defines that? What are the benefits of that intervention? By whom and for what? And that is a conversation in itself. Why is that a problem, and why is that important? That is important when we think about health equity, because, for example, and if you've seen my talks, you've seen the examples that I give, you might have the best intervention, you might have the best strategy, but if you plop that in a place that it's unsafe, for example, for your patients or your partners or your community members to come, it's not going to work. Right? You can place that in terms of the context of ableism. You can place that in context of immigration. You can place that in context of policies of transgender, for example, that we're seeing right now. So we need to, as a field of implementation science, really consider context and what is it that the community needs. Do we need another pill? Or do we need to think through the context and how to make the community safe? And there are some studies now in the context of health equity and translation science, obesity prevention, showing that sometimes tackling social determinants of health is actually beneficial in mental health, for example. So there's that. Okay. They offer us theories of reflexivity, theories that help us think through how can we conceptualize what evidence is and what for. They don't have figures, but they have beautiful tables that you should read. We're taking figures. Then, hold on. Am I skipping? I skipped one. there is a second session titled Structural Violence, Intersectionality, and Related Theories, Understanding and Addressing Health Disparities, which is exactly what I was saying, right? So it does not matter, again, if you have the it and if you know the how, if the setting is not beneficial. Racism is very much there, and we're seeing it over and over and over, right? We have data. It doesn't matter what kind of disease you have, showing that racism exists. My dog agrees. And so, what are we doing as a field to address that? And they ask very important questions and reflective questions in terms of power and privilege. I might speak multiple languages and I might, use my Latina card, but I look very much like a white female cisgender, and that gives me power. How do I use that power to support others, to embrace others, to empower others? And when is it that time that I need to shut down and just listen to my community members? And we haven't talked about that in the field of implementation science, unfortunately. Okay, the last one. I had coffee, I told you.
You're on a roll.
Yeah. And then the last one, coming from the dissemination and policy perspective that I've been playing a lot recently, talks about the external context. So even in the context of CIFR and CIFR 2.0 has the external context, right? And they try to disentangle what does that mean in terms of policy and organization. There is the TICD, which talks about like interrelationship between organizations, etc. But normally, a lot of us, me included, talk about, you have the intervention, we may have different community members, and then you're like, oh, but there is Medicaid, Medicare that didn't allow us to do this. Or, right, there's this policy and there's that thing over there that we put our blind spots, except when you're a Jonathan Pirtle, Ross Baumann, it's a whole different literature where they are trying to tackle policy, but it's not necessarily communicating with us, right? And they question that. And they question that from the perspective of anthropology, saying that policies are born by people and they have a context. And we, as implementation scientists, should embed and play on that context. Right? Again, I might have the best medicine to treat pain episodes for people with sickle cell disease, but if they don't have money, or if the insurance says, no, thank you, I'm not going to pay for that, what is the point? And how can we implementation scientists from the get-go consider those policies and the fact of economic variables, et cetera, in our work ahead of time, and or consider policing as an action, not as something that affects the way that we work. So I'm going to put a plug, because I wrote a paper on dissemination research. And the paper was born to, I needed to figure out what kind of methodologies were out there, because I wanted to answer one of our customers, and I ended up not knowing anything. I think we need, as a field, to do more studies on implementation, dissemination, on dissemination of information, on dissemination of the consequences of the policies in our work. We need to stop being so afraid of the contextual external variables and actually embrace them in what we do, because otherwise I think we're going to keep replicating whatever it is that we're doing, and we're not closing the quality gap, which was what we set up to do. Right. The end. Wow.
I think leave it to Anna. Basically, she gave everyone else's talk all combined in a coherent whole. That was amazing.
Very amazing.
And brings it back around too, because I think it is one of the dangers. I think being a colonizer is also being like an intellectual colonizer, right? And so and then you're replicating the evidence to practice gap, right? And so which is what Geoff was talking about, and you're not taking into account context. So one of the things that I was striking me about all of this is that, sometimes we set up, I think, a little bit of a false choice between theory and practicality. And I think we can have our cake and eat it too here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you can have really complicated, dense theories if you're working with partners and you can make it practical at the same time and have tools and things that people can actually use. And all that, some of that theory, can be a little bit in the background, or it can be in the foreground and, working directly with people on the ground. So I don't know. I think we can get there and do all of it, kind of simultaneously.
But what is funny, not funny, haha, funny in terms of, I don't know what to do with this data. We know that the field, when we take a look at the empirical studies, we don't necessarily know how to embed the theory in our studies, right? And this is the same thing that we did with the dissemination studies. Like, people mention the thing, like, I'm going to use re-aim, and then you take a look at the methods and there's no re-aim, there may be a reach, and then you're like, okay, but what does that mean? So as a field, I don't know what's happening. What is the tension between the theories models that we are labeling them, but we're not embedding them, which then maybe that's why we're not testing them and then not taking a critical eyes on what it is they're happening?
I totally agree. I mean, I think like one of the number one sort of things I say about papers and projects with young folks entering into the field is they know enough to, I think, to do what you're saying, Anna, is to kind of throw some stuff in the beginning, either of a grant or a paper, and then it disappears. And so I'm like, well, you're really not using it. You're just putting it in because you think some reviewer wants to see that. And then it just gets replicated over and over and over. And we don't have any real attempt to kind of empirically understand these theories and break them apart.
Thank you, Russ. Yes, well, there's many, I mean, I feel very motivated. I hope our audience feels very inspired and motivated, because there's a lot for us to think about and do more work on, a lot of connections among these pieces. And also wanted to mention, in addition to Matt's upcoming replication workshop, Laura Damschroeder and Matt and colleagues will be joining us for a beachside chat on CFR 2.0. So we can continue talking about some of these issues when we hear from Laura and colleagues about this latest incarnation. I know we're at the top of the hour. Matt, yes, closing thought.
Well, yeah. No, just about the replication thing. So if folks have ideas, this is to the audience, if folks have replications that they're thinking about, bring them to the session and offer them up. And it'd be nice if we could not just hear me drone on and on, but actually work on some of your ideas, and then we can kind of use sort of this implementation replication framework to help you in your next endeavor. So come bearing stuff, and you might get more out of it.
We'll get some work done during the workshop.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Really, really fun. Thank you so much to Geoff, Matt, Anna, Russ, and Erin, who was very prepared to do this. Just the weather did not agree, but thank you all so much for this time and opportunity to talk through these super interesting topics. So until next time, take care, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Good seeing
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.